3 senior Indian Revenue Service officers were discharged from their responsibilities by the Modi government for allegedly formulating and making public a document where they made several contentious proposals like a tax for the super rich, a COVID-19 cess, etc. Now, what is this entire controversy about is what we're going to try and decode in this episode of Government Matters. Do send in your questions. We are live. Sanya Dhingra, who tracks the government, the bureaucracy for ThePrint, and who in fact broke the story on this report by the IRS officers, is with me today. So Sanya, let's go back a little bit and first understand what this report was and who prepared it.
So this report, Ruhi, was prepared by 50 very young IRS officers. If you see the names of the authors of the report, they are from the 2016, 14, 15 batch all the way to the 2019 batch. Basically officers who are still undergoing their training.
Right.
So extremely young officers, and 50 of them, they prepared this report, and this was supposed to be a recommendation to the government, a very comprehensive sort of recommendation to the government on what steps it could take in order to sort of give a boost to the economy given what has happened in the last one and a half months because of the lockdown due to COVID.
Right.
So it's about a 30-page document, very comprehensive, very contentious of course, but it's something that was prepared last week, and it was in fact given to the CBDT on behalf of the IRS Association and the officers, and then of course this fallout happened.
So what kind of proposals did it have that it was so controversial?
So some of the very controversial proposals from this report were of course having a 40% tax on people who have a salary of more than 1 crore an annum. They had recommendations such as coming back with the wealth tax, which is something that was abrogated earlier, coming up with an inheritance tax, levying taxes on foreign companies. So basically this document, although it also included some other proposals as well in order to, which talked about how to cut down taxes and how to boost the consumption of people by sort of reducing interest rates and so on, but those are of course not because those were not as contentious. They did not catch people's attention as such, and these became the most controversial aspects of this report, and then we've seen what has happened since.
Right. So what has happened since?
Yeah. So on Saturday we did a story on this report. Within an hour or so of that, the report was shared by the IRS Association's Twitter handle as well. They shared the story and they shared the report as well, the entire document. By Sunday, what we started seeing was that a lot of trolling started happening. IRS officers were being trolled on Twitter, on Facebook. So people started reacting very, very adversely to these aspects of this report. Of people started saying that there's no income at this time, and these officers are talking about increasing the taxes so much. And also, I think there was some degree of confusion because to the lay person it wasn't very clear if this is a recommendation to the government or
by the government,
or is it something that the government actually proposes to do. So by evening we had finance ministry sources tell the media that we are distancing ourselves from this report. This report was entirely unauthorized, and they called the report irresponsible as well, and they said that we will be initiating inquiries against some of the officers. And yes, by last night we actually saw the CBDT come out with these orders in which 3 very senior officers, these are not officers who were authors of the report, but these are office bearers in the IRS Association and officers who the government claims were sort of who misguided these the young officers.
My next question is that, I mean, if there are 50 odd IRS officers who've prepared the report, one, how are you singling out 3 who, as you said, are not even authors of the report, and on what basis is the government alleging that they were behind the drafting of the report?
So what the government is saying is that we would have even considered some of these proposals had this report come to us through proper channels, which our sources in the IRS association tell us that that happened. We presented the report to the government. However, what the government has actually taken very strong exception against is the IRS association going public with this report in this manner. So what the government has been constantly saying is that this is a time when there is so much uncertainty and there is so much people have no idea about how they're going to sustain their livelihoods, and these officers, according to the government, they have been highly irresponsible by creating this kind of panic in the economy by and how they've singled out these officers is that two of them are office bearers of the IRS association, and it's the IRS association which went public with this,
put it out
with this document in that sense. So they're holding the IRS association responsible for sort of creating this kind of panic. And there is another officer who's not a part of the IRS association, but the government says they have reason to believe that he's one of the officers who actually encouraged the 50 officers to write this report in the first place.
Right.
So they're saying that this is an unauthorized report, and the question the government is asking is that in what capacity did these senior officers ask their juniors to
draft a report of this nature?
However, I'd like to add, Ruhi, that we've been talking to a lot of officers, and they do believe that had the government had a problem with this report, they could have stated very, very unequivocally, like they have, that the government has nothing to do with this report. But penalizing officers in this fashion by sort of discharging them of their duties and initiating this kind of issuing these charge sheets against
the charge sheet is a bit extreme. Isn't that a sense among the bureaucracy as well?
Exactly. So they're saying that on one hand, the general public, the perception of bureaucracy in the general public is that they never speak up, and they're just they're just basically yes men in the government,
puppets,
puppets in the hands of politicians. And when they actually
express themselves,
this is not to say that we side with the report or we are opposed to the report, but it's just something that the officers came up with on their own. But to penalize them for expressing their views in this fashion, when there is such a crisis in the country, officers are saying this is highly demotivating, and this is what sort of encourages this atmosphere of
fear and always towing the line,
and it's a chilling sort of message that it sends down, percolates down the bureaucracy.
Right. Now I've started getting a few viewer questions. The first one is from Polomi. Will the government actually work on the suggestions by IRS officers, or is the government putting up a show? Well, they've said they don't accept the recommendations.
Yeah, in fact, again, all of this is coming from sources in the government, and sources have said that we would have considered some of the proposals, but because this report has created so much panic in the country that they've had to distance themselves. But going ahead, if a month down the line the government actually ends up accepting a proposal or two, we can't predict that. We can't predict that. But as of now, the government has, as sort of unequivocally as they could, they've distanced themselves from this report.
Right. Raymond wants to know, don't IRS officers have freedom of expression? Can't the bureaucracy put forward a legitimate suggestion to the government? I mean, surely everybody has the right to express. I mean, you understand that you work within a certain protocol, of course, but as we've discussed earlier, the extreme nature of the step makes people, has it created a fear among the bureaucrats to never express themselves?
Yeah. No, in fact, this is a larger question of the rules that sort of determine the conduct of bureaucrats in the country, and a lot of people believe that these rules are very archaic because they do not allow government officers to criticize anything about the government, any policy about of the government. They do not allow officers to sort of course some of these restrictions are very, very legitimate because officers are in very key positions, and they are in sometimes very sensitive positions, and they can't be irresponsible about what how much they divulge about government policy and so on. But there is this very strong belief that some of the restrictions can be very, very archaic and draconian. We've had over the years, in the last 2-3 years, we have cases like Shah Faisal, and we've had cases like G. Kannan, who are IRS officers, who've just said something against the government, and the ramifications have been very, very adverse. And,
so is that something which is a greater worry among the bureaucrats in terms of the reaction of the Modi government, the disproportionate reaction to any small thing that they might not agree with, which a civil servant says.
Yeah, no, of course it's there, and it's been there over the last few years. In fact, since yesterday, since last night when we've been talking to officers, a lot of them are saying this is why we stopped talking to the media, and this is why we've just become quieter than we ever were before. Because you see this kind of a reaction that's seen as extremely disproportionate to the act. Most officers are saying that, it was at the end of it a recommendation by very, very young officers. Are you going to have this sort of a very extreme clampdown?
Right. There's a viewer question. One of the 3 senior officers charge sheeted is the husband of a Congress MLA. Was politics not the reason behind this move rather than good faith?
To be sure, we have no reason to believe that there was any political motive to the action that the government has taken. It seems like the panic that this report created sort of compelled the government to take such an extreme step. But yes, the fact that this has constantly come up, the fact that one of the officers' wife is a Congress MLA, is leading officers to believe that why is this kind of news coming up again and again, and who is floating this news? How is anyone's spouse got anything to do with their action,
professional actions?
So yeah, this is a question that some of them are asking, but we don't have any reason to believe that these actions are politically motivated.
Now, my next viewer question is a flip, and you take off from there, which is from Arun. Is it possible that the report was politically motivated? So now there are conspiracy theories abound.
Well, I can talk about one conspiracy theory without promoting it ourselves, or without saying that we believe in it. But one of the conspiracy theories is that this report was something that the government wanted in the first place. In fact, we've had some officers tell us that this report was presented to the government, and the feedback from the government was in fact very, very positive to this report. It's only when the government sort of started gauging the public reaction to this report that they very sternly distanced themselves from it. So some people do believe that it is something that the government itself wanted to explore, and it decided to explore it through this report, gauge the response of the public. Because let's not forget, this happened just a day after the government cancelled the dearance allowance of of lakhs of central government employees. So the government perhaps wanted to, the conspiracy theory says that the government wanted to play safe, see how this report is taken.
Could be a bit of a stretch, we don't know. Let's not go by conspiracy theories too much. There is a question from Tapas. Would the lack of action have sent a wrong message to investors who want to invest in India after the pandemic ends? So essentially, if the government had not taken such an extreme action, which is what I understand this viewer wants to know, would it have sent out a wrong message to the super rich, to people who, at the end of the day, it's a government which has to be voted back to power as well, so to its own constituency in terms of its intentions?
No, in fact, at least some people who we've spoken to is that to have said that what the government has done is in fact reasonable. They have still gone ahead and taken action against these officers under conduct rules, and not under the Disaster Management Act, in which case the actions against these officers could have been way stricter. So what some people believe is that the government has still tried to kind of take a balanced stand on the issue, show to the public that this was not something that the government advocated in any way, and look, we are punishing the people who are behind it, but the government is still trying to in some way protect these officers. So again, many conspiracy theories, but yes, of course the government had to do whatever it could in order to ensure that the public at large is not antagonized, and as you said, their voter base is not antagonized in any way.
Parimal has a question which is actually quite similar to what you were just talking about. Was the tough action against the IRS officers a face-saving move by the government? Is the government right to throw officers under the bus? Like, essentially, was it's just trying to save itself more than punish anybody?
It could entirely be the case that these 3 officers are being used as scapegoats in this entire episode. As we said, there's a very strong opinion among some people that this is something the government wanted. The government had thrown its weight behind it. When it saw that the reaction is so adverse, it used these officers to kind of distance itself from the report. So yes, these are, but as of now, this report is shrouded in so much mystery that whether the government had authorized this report, although the government is very clearly saying that it did not, but who authorized this report, who asked these officers officers, very young officers, some of them were still undergoing their training. What was their motivation to come up with a report? Was it just a bunch of very young enthusiastic officers trying to come in the good books of the government by recommending some radical measures? We don't know. It's at this point a lot of it is just guessing and sort
of as you mentioned, a lot of conjecture and a lot of conspiracy theories, which I think it's important to steer clear of till there is greater clarity on why the officers drafted a report like that and why the government has reacted in such an extreme fashion. But Sanya, before we end, just one last question: what next? What happens to these 3 officers now?
Well, these officers, if you see the orders that have been issued against these officers, they've been given 15 days to come up with the justification, to come up with their defense. They have to give their in 15 days they have to give their defense to the CBDT, which is their cadre controlling organization, and on the basis of that further action will be taken. But what we can say for sure is that even what the government orders kind of hint at is that these are officers who against whom there has been no other allegation.
So they've had a clean record.
They've had an extremely clean record. Even the government orders don't talk about anything but the fact that this report created some panic in the public. So these are officers who we can say have a clean record to some extent,
which may go in their favor eventually.
Which may go in their favor. So let's see how things pan out.
Well, thank you, Sanya. Thank you so much for watching Government Matters and for sending your questions. Some viewers like Gokul, Suraj, Renoy, we are really sorry we couldn't take your questions, but surely we will the next time. Do stay tuned. We have 2 more live shows coming up today: Politically Correct with our political editor DK Singh and Cut the Clutter in Hindi with our editor-in-chief Shekhar Gupta.